and found nothing at all to eat.
More than 500 of both sexes died at this time, prostrated by suffering. Most serious of all, their trusty steeds, companions in battle, on whom their masters depended for their own safety, and whose glory should be seen in prancing hoof and gleaming teeth, gave way like common beasts of burden.
After months of this torturous journey, there was one notable casualty: Gotthilda, the wife of one of the chief commanders of the Crusade, Baldwin, the Count of Bologna.
Gotthilda was a very, very wealthy woman. She would have held estates and had finances that Baldwin, as her husband, would have had a route into. If she died, these would go back to her family. He wouldn't have access to her. They would stay with her bloodline. Her death means that his chances of becoming rich when he went back home had gone. His mindset would change. He was now potentially on the lookout for lands, for territory, for wealth of his own. Within a day or so of her death, his policy became one of acquisition and greed.
The chroniclers make no mention of his grief, only that Baldwin took a few hundred knights and left the main army on a solo mission. If he was to make up for the loss of his wife's wealth, the easiest course would be to seize a city of his own. 100 miles to the east was the perfect target: Edessa.
Edessa is a wealthy city. It generates its own income through metalwork. It's a very fertile region. It's very close to the Euphrates River. It's also on the trade routes. So you've got spices and luxury cloths coming across from the east, passing through it, and then going to the Mediterranean for further trade. It's a really, really good spot for Baldwin to base himself.
The problem for Baldwin was that Edessa was not in Muslim hands. It was a Christian city that had held out against the Turks. But the people of Edessa had grown weary of constant attacks by the Muslims. When news spread that a great Crusader prince was close by, the citizens pleaded with their governor, Thoros, to invite Baldwin to come to their aid.
The governor of the city was a Christian Armenian called Thoros. He was a feeble old man, without child of either sex. He was a useless overlord. He was unable to protect his citizens from wrongs or to procure them relief from the dangers of attack from these cursed infidels.
Baldwin's help would come at a price. He would protect Edessa from the Turks in return for the keys to the city. Thoros naively promised to make Baldwin the new ruler, but only after his death. The old man then sealed his own fate by adopting Baldwin as his son. For Baldwin, Thoros' death would not come soon enough.
Baldwin discovered evil counselors in Edessa, traitors who plotted with him to have Thoros murdered and who promised to hand Edessa over to him.
Thoros realized too late that he had been deceived. He ran for his life.
He took a rope and let it down from the tower. But immediately his destroyers shot him down into the middle of the street. And cutting off his head, they carried it on a spear through the quarters of the city for everyone to mock.
It's not a good start for crusading ideology, it has to be said. This is not a great moment in the idea that Christianity is going to come to save Eastern Christendom from the threat of Islam. The reality is that Baldwin has come with an eye to gaining territory, and I think he's prepared to remove physically and politically a figure who's Christian from power to get his own territory.
If there had been no Islam in that world, but you had had Eastern Christianity, which you had, after all, before the rise of Islam, exactly the same thing would have happened, but they would have had to find a different ideological colouring for it. They probably would have said, these are not proper Christians, we're the true Christians, like religious fundamentalists of all hues say. So, from that point of view, many Christians in that region also regarded the Crusaders as essentially Christian fundamentalist barbarians from the uncivilized lands of the north.
As Baldwin celebrated his successful takeover of Edessa, 150 miles to the southwest, the main Crusader army arrived at the great walled city of Antioch. Since the time of the Apostle St. Peter, it had become a thriving Christian city. But in 1085, the Turks had seized control. This would be a prize second only to Jerusalem, a prize worth dying for. The splendor of Antioch is hard to see today. The once majestic city now lies in ruins in the hill country of eastern Turkey. But for one knight, who after a year on crusade caught his first glimpse of the ancient capital in 1097, it was awe-inspiring.
The city is surrounded by two walls, one of which is very high and amazingly broad. It's built with huge stones, and there are set up on it 450 towers. It's shut in by 4 mountains, and alongside the city walls runs a deep river. And everything about the city is beautiful.
I think the Crusaders want to take the city for a whole range of reasons. First and probably foremost is strategic. Antioch is literally the gateway to Syria and the gateway to the Holy Land. If they leave the city behind them, their route for escape and certainly their route for resupply and reinforcement is going to be cut off. Spiritually, it's almost the equal of Jerusalem in many ways as a goal, because Antioch was, in Christian tradition, the site of the founding of the very, very first Christian church by St. Peter, the Apostle of Christ. So this gave it a real spiritual power and a spiritual cachet that I think the Crusaders were very empowered by.
The majority of Antioch's inhabitants were Armenian and Greek Orthodox Christians. Their Turkish rulers granted them total freedom to worship. But this was not enough for the Crusaders outside the city walls. They wanted to remove the Turks from power and return the city to Christian rule. But taking it back wouldn't be easy.
Antioch is a very well-defended city indeed. The walls surrounding the city, here high on the mountain, going down to the plain, are very massive. You can see that, the construction here, a strong, stout, thick inner core, faced with this fine exterior. Reinforced, of course, with a system of towers. The towers interlock with one another. This is the kind of wall you don't shift with a battering ram.
The Christian chroniclers weren't alone in recording the tale of the bloody struggle for Antioch. Ibn al-Athir traveled far and wide, collecting tales of the great Muslim heroes who resisted the Crusaders, the Franks as he called them. His celebrated history tells of the spirited Turkish leader of Antioch, Yagi Shihan.
Yagi Shihan, the ruler of Antioch, showed unparalleled wisdom and courage, strength and judgment. If all the Franks who died attacking his city had survived, they would have overrun all the lands of Islam.
Ibn al-Athir would recount how Yagi Shihan, a man fabled for his big hairy ears and thick gray beard, did his utmost to keep the enemy out. But he knew any of the local Christians might be persuaded to let the Franks in.
When he heard the approach of the Franks, he was not sure how the Christian people of the city would react. So he sent all the Muslims outside the city walls to dig trenches. And the next day, he sent the Christians by themselves to do the same task. When they were ready to return home at the end of the day, he refused to allow them in. "Antioch is yours," he said. "But you have to leave it to me until I found out what happens between us and the Franks."
Yagi Shihan believed he had made Antioch unassailable. He then turned his attention to the Crusader army amassing outside his city walls.
Yaghi is praised by all the sources about his good organization of the defense, night and day, night shifts, night guards, throwing oil at the Crusaders, depriving them from food supplies, sending guards during the night to attack their camps, burn some of their tents, depriving them of water supplies. He really confronted the Crusaders alone, and he fought vigorously to defend his city.
His efforts paid off. After 8 arduous months, the Crusaders were no closer to getting in, and conditions in the camp were utterly desperate. Food had always been scarce, and they had the expelled Christians to feed as well. As the siege dragged on, the Crusaders had virtually nothing left to eat. The Christian chronicler William of Tyre told how the Crusaders were forced to drain blood from their own horses and drink it.
Day by day, the shortage of provisions continued and the famine grew. And as a result, a pestilence broke out among the legions in the camp, so fatal that there was now scarcely room to bury the dead. With the loss of those who had wasted away through hunger and disease, and of others who had perished by the sword, the army had diminished to such an extent, it seemed as if barely half our numbers had survived.
The suffering of the Crusaders was about to get worse. In a medieval Islamic text, Dr. Taif al-Azari has discovered how the leader of Antioch, Yagi Shihan, was able to summon reinforcements right under the nose of the Crusaders.
The answer was this: a pigeon. The Seljuk Turks were the first one to invent the postal service, kind of DHL of today. They will attach a message to the bird's leg and set it free. In a matter of hours, the message will come across and the help will arrive from anywhere in the Muslim world.
Two months later, Christian scouts reported that a massive Turkish army was on its way. The Crusaders had no time. They needed to break into the city quickly. It was Bohemund who found the weak spot in the city's defenses, a traitor in the Muslim ranks.
He was an armorer, a maker of breastplates, named Firuz. He worked at the tower that stood over the riverbed where the water flowed from the city into the valley. He had long served the ruler of Antioch, Yagi Shihan. But he sealed a pact with the Franks. They bribed him with a fortune in money and lands.
Firuz was the commander not only of one tower, but of 3 towers. Bohemund really hit gold dust. For whatever reason, he was ready to betray the